I've talked on the show about arguing on principle. Now, and I've also talked about this previously too, but we're going to go over it briefly again. I've proposed that there are 3 tiers of argumentation. There's arguing on principle, there's arguing on practice, and there's arguing on medicine. And there's arguing on optics. The strongest form of argumentation is the arguments on principle. The weakest is the arguments on optics. In between that is the arguments on practice. And the reason, very straightforwardly, is that if you present an argument that's properly on principle, that in order to negate that, you have to introduce a new principle. You can't actually negate an argument on principle. You'd have to present a new argument that would contradict that previous argument. So it wouldn't actually be working even within the framework of that argument. That's how strong arguments on principle are. That you have to present an entirely new argument. Arguments on practice are arguments where you can work within the framework of the argument, but in order to dismantle the conclusions to be drawn, all you have to do is modify the conditions of the argument, right? So in the case of arguing for something on practice, well, what happens if this condition isn't there? Well, then the argument falls apart. In the case of arguments on optics, you don't even have to consider the inputs here. You can just take the argument itself and say, I don't care. You can dismantle the argument with that argument, not with an argument with different conditions, not with a different argument, but with the argument itself unadulterated. And the example I've given, I should really put out a video on my series on philosophical concepts of Mike's 3 tiers of argumentation and Mike's rule. But the way that this works, the example I've used is stealing medicine. Let's say you've got some life-saving medicine that you need, right? Should you steal the medicine? One answer would be no, stealing is bad. No, stealing is bad, period. No matter what. Well, what if no? There is no what if. Stealing is bad, period. You don't steal the medicine. Well, what if, then he might die if he doesn't do all the other things he would need to do to obtain the medicine legally. And that's a tragedy, but you shouldn't steal medicine. Don't steal the medicine. Okay, now let's argue on, in order to negate that, you have to introduce an entirely new principle. You have to look at this from an entirely new framework. So you can't even work within the same framework and negate that stealing is wrong. Maybe you could break down the concept of what constitutes stealing. And then again, you're dealing with a philosophical concept that goes beyond the argument itself. So if we're arguing on practice, you should steal the medicine because it's really expensive and you can't afford it unless you steal it. You can't afford it at the current price unless you steal it. Oh, well, I mean, the condition that you would change then is, well, it's not the only show in town. There's another pharmacy right across the street that sells it for half the price. Right? So in that case, if your argument is you should steal it because it's unaffordable, well, what happens when there's a pharmacy right across the street that's selling it for an affordable price? Well, then you shouldn't steal it because it is affordable. So all you have to do in that case is change the because it's unaffordable. All you have to do is change the conditions and the argument falls apart. How about argument on optics? You should steal it. You should steal the medicine because we don't want to look like a town that doesn't care for its elderly. Because won't somebody please think of the children? And the way you negate this argument is, no, I don't care. I don't care what the rest of the town thinks of us, right? You can work within that same argument and say, no, I don't care about the optics. Right? I could argue that you shouldn't steal the medicine because we should be a town of law and order. We don't want to look like we're some town that doesn't care about law and order and has this high level of crime rates that scare away the developers and scare away business owners. And I could say, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care about the optics. In fact, I just presented 2 arguments from the same side of the coin that are the optics argument. It's just the optics argument turned around. If you steal it, it's going to make us look bad. Oh, no, I disagree. I think if we steal it, it's going to make us look good. So in that case, in a case of an optics argument, it's so weak that I can use the argument itself against itself. Unfortunately, the strength of unfortunately, we have this is not how it plays out in the real world. This is not how the strength of an argument isn't saying which argument is the one that's going to convince the most people. And in fact, this is Mike's rule. I've talked about it before. The strength of an argument is inversely proportional to the effectiveness of the argument. In the case of the principled argument to steal the medicine versus the optics argument to steal the medicine, most people are going to be persuaded to either steal the medicine or not steal the medicine based on how it's going to make them look. On the optics argument, how does this look, right? The remainder are going to be convinced almost entirely in the arguments in practice. Well, that it's unaffordable, therefore he should steal it. Well, what happens when it becomes affordable? What happens when there's, yeah. So that's going to capture basically everyone else. The argument of stealing is wrong, you shouldn't steal it, is unfortunately not going to convince people. It's unfortunately not an effective argument, even though it's a stronger one.